Hi guys, this is Mrs. Perez. This is Chapter 16, Section 2, The Battle Over Reconstruction. I'll warn you before we even start that there's a lot of information in this section, and we're going to spend a lot of time in class breaking down everything we cover here, so try not to get overwhelmed. This is the overview. We'll get there. Let's dive right in. So we have the 13th Amendment being passed around this time. Before his death, Lincoln worked really hard to see the 13th Amendment passed, and it was approved in January of 1865. Yes, you'll notice that is before the end of the Civil War. And this amendment abolished or ended slavery throughout the United States. You'll remember we talked about the different plans for Reconstruction in the last section that we looked at together. And that's why in both Lincoln's plan and the Wade Davis bill, we wanted the states that were returning to the Union to abolish slavery in their state constitutions. Even though this was a law in the United States, right? Amendments are national laws that everyone needs to follow. We wanted it in writing that the Confederate states were going to acknowledge and actually follow the law that we've passed as a nation. So, the problem is, right, neither Lincoln's plan nor the Wade Davis bill actually went into action. Johnson's plan is what we wind up with. Johnson's plan was proposed in 1865, after Lincoln's death, obviously, and his goal was a combination of the two plans we looked at previously. He wanted to reunite the nation quickly, just like Lincoln wanted to do, but he also wanted to appease radical Republicans, right? He wanted to find a compromise maybe that everybody could live with. So Johnson offered amnesty for most Confederates. He agreed that each state had to abolish slavery. And to take it a step further, to really get that acknowledgement of our new national anti-slavery stance, Johnson wanted each state to ratify or approve the 13th Amendment. Radical Republicans were angered by Johnson's plan, even though that wasn't his goal. He wasn't trying to anger them, right? But most Confederate states met those terms really quickly. So, welcome back to the Union. Here you are. And then, here's the part that really made the Radical Republicans angry. Then those Confederate states elected Confederate leaders to Congress. Radical Republicans in Congress don't want to be working alongside the people that they just fought with in a literal war, right? So people aren't too happy with the results of Johnson's plan. And even though we have an end to slavery, does that mean equality? Absolutely not, as you'll see throughout this chapter and throughout the rest of our year and possibly lives in social studies. So in southern states at this time, black codes arise. Black codes are laws that states put in place in order to oppress or control African Americans. Slavery is illegal, right? That's the big takeaway at the end of the Civil War. But there are other forms of prejudice that are being turned into laws. So looking at Mississippi, for example, black people aren't allowed to vote or serve on juries at this time. Okay, I'm not quite seeing the fairness in this, right? It doesn't exactly make sense. Furthermore, you're going to enjoy the irony in this one. If a black person was fined in court and couldn't pay, they could be hired out to a white person who would then pay the debt for them. Is this essentially, I guess it's more indentured servitude than slavery, but think about this idea that, again, you could be forced to work for someone when you had just gained supposed freedom. These black codes are super restrictive, they're super harmful and painful, and African Americans are obviously not happy about them, and the people who fought to end slavery aren't happy about them either. So we get the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is proposed in response to black codes. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 guaranteed citizenship rights to all African Americans. And it guaranteed the civil rights of all people except Native Americans. Does that seem to make sense? No, but we're going to continue to talk about the very complicated relationship between Native Americans and the American government. So Johnson himself vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He didn't like it. He denied it. But ultimately, it became a law because of support from Congress and the Senate. The thing is, acts of Congress are temporary, right? They're bound in time. They don't affect our nation forever. So we needed a more permanent addition of this, for lack of a better word, to really keep this in the law. Enter the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was approved in 1868, and it says that all people who are born or naturalized in the United States are citizens regardless of their race. And naturalization is the process that you go through if you're an immigrant from another country. When you naturalize, you become a citizen of this country or whatever country you move to, and that means you're as good as somebody who was born here. As good is the terrible way to phrase it. But in the eyes of the government, you are considered equal to someone who was born here. That would be a better way. The 14th Amendment said that no individual state can take away the rights of a citizen. It also said that all citizens have equal protection under the law. And to take it a step further, it said that any state that denies males that are 21 or older the right to vote will lose representation in Congress. Okay, we're making progress, it seems. If you're like me, you find this amendment, or if you're like me, you're worried that this amendment was ever necessary, right? If the 13th Amendment said there's no more slavery, obviously people should be, if you're not a slave, you're a citizen, right? Wait, how is that not obvious? Why do we need this restatement of what should be a fact? But we did need it, and we got it. So, success. Moving on to maybe less success, or more punishment, I should say. We get the Reconstruction Act of 1867. It was passed by radical Republicans in Congress in 1867, and the goal was to seize all control from former Confederate states. So we have black codes in the South. We have a lot of continued racism and oppression, and radical Republicans in Congress want to see that change. So they removed power from all states that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. So if you couldn't agree that everyone who was born or naturalized here is a citizen regardless of their race, that means you have no more power in our government. You don't have a voice in Congress. You're out of the picture. And it put them under military law, where the United States government was really running the show. Each of those states had to write a new state constitution. Each of those states had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And each of those states had to allow African Americans to vote. So this was a way to try to, I guess, force people to play nice, for lack of a better way of saying that. We'll look more in class at the tensions that came up because of this and what the experience was really like under the Reconstruction Act of 1867. So we see a lot of bad stuff, but there's some good stuff too that we could worry about, or not worry about, be happy about. So between 1872 to 1901, there were 16 African Americans serving in the House of Representatives, and again, that seems like a very small number compared to the number of representatives that are actually in Congress, right? But it's the first. There's progress being made. We have another first in the next bullet point. Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce were the first African Americans to serve in the Senate. So again, we're finally seeing African Americans having some sort of voice and say and position of power. Southern states begin opening public schools around this time. Remember that because of how spread out many plantations were, it was rarer for there to be public schools in the South. It was more likely that you did private tutoring if you were educated, but public schools now become more of the norm. Women gain property rights around this time. Great for us. And we have two specific groups that are supporting African Americans at this time. Groups is the wrong word. Types of people might be a better way to put it. So there are scalawags. These are Southern whites who had opposed secession in the first place. They never wanted to rebel. They thought the war was unnecessary, right? So if scalawags have been allied to the African American cause from the beginning, or that might be generous for some people, they wanted to stay in the Union from the beginning, they'll be more compliant. They'll do what the U.S. government wants in order to become a part of the Union now, right? And then we have carpetbaggers, or northern whites who went south to help change southern culture. People with the northern ideals, which, as you remember, had been anti-slavery for quite some time, going down south to help try to change the way people think. These are all good things that are going to help bring about some progress. Oh, there are many slides today, and I'm sorry, because you are annoyed with me for that. Johnson's impeachment trial. So in 1868, the House of Representatives wanted to impeach President Johnson or fire him from political office. At this time, the House was dominated by radical Republicans, and they thought that Johnson was betraying the United States by being so forgiving to former Confederate states, right? They were at war with us. If you are being nice to them, you're a traitor to your own nation. You're a traitor to your own cause. That was the thought. The trial went on. Johnson wasn't impeached. He actually won by just one vote, and he was able to remain our president. But then an election rolls around. So we get the election of 1868. Ulysses S. Grant, the former general of the Union Army, was elected president. And since the Reconstruction Act had demanded that African Americans be allowed to vote, many exercised their right to vote by voting for Grant. He was a Union leader, right? He had helped win a lot of victories against the South. He contributed to the Union's cause. Seems like a good guy to vote for. Grant himself was a moderate, and his election began the end of the radical Republican movement. We have a more middle-of-the-road president, and he's going to help level us out a little bit. Continuing on, we get the 15th Amendment, the last of the Reconstruction Amendments. This was approved in 1869, and it guaranteed the right to vote to all African American males. And it could not be denied, and said that they could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, this feels redundant, right? We had the 14th Amendment saying that regardless of your race, you're a citizen. Well, in this country, all citizens can vote. Why do we need this extra step of saying you can't stop someone from voting because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude? Why do we need this? We did, because people weren't listening. So even though we have this amendment, as you'll see, states could get around this. And they could use it to not openly say that they were just preventing African Americans from voting, but do things that would hurt African Americans more than people of other races, if that makes sense. So states could say that people needed to own property or pay taxes in order to vote. Well, who's going to be more capable of that? Someone who's been able to work for their own entire lives for pay and have money in the bank and could buy a house or could pay their taxes, right? Or someone who has been enslaved for their entire lives, was allowed no education, not even given, couldn't even have the right to educate themselves. How are you going to expect them to meet these demands? So there are ways around the 15th Amendment, and we'll see how this played out when we look at some more specific documents in class. Okay, moving on to the last slide today. We're ending on a decidedly pessimistic note. So we have some whites feeling really helpless now that blacks are gaining power. Is it anywhere equal to the power that whites have? No. But even seeing African Americans gain a little bit of power makes some people uncomfortable, and that leads them to form the Ku Klux Klan, whose goal was to terrorize blacks and the whites that supported them. So we saw carpetbaggers and scalawags previously, right? What did they do? Well, they shouted threats. They would burn crosses on people's lawns, and that all seems mild compared to the fact that they whipped, tortured, shot, hung African Americans and white Republicans. It was a time of great, not just spoken violence, but physical violence. Congress tried to intervene with the KKK Acts of 1870, and 1871, which banned the use of force against voters. Murdering someone is always going to be breaking the law, though, right? So these don't seem like people that are really playing by the rules. We'll look more at the Ku Klux Klan and the role that they played in class. Again, I know this was a lot of information, but we're going to dig deep into it all and see how this period of Reconstruction really played out in our nation. That's it for today, guys. Have a great afternoon.